Thanks so much, everybody. I see that the attendees are going up a little bit, minute by minute, so we'll just give 2 more minutes to let people filter in. And I'll just start talking a little bit about what North American Millets Alliance is doing. So we're just so pleased that everybody has taken the time to join us today. This is a very exciting, really monumental event for those of us who have been behind NAMA and wanting to raise awareness around millets as a group of crops and food ingredients in North America. And so, it's a 201, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Joni Kimmel Moore, and I'm actually the founder of Snacktivist Foods as well. So I work on the consumer side, and we make a product line and we use millets. So I'm very involved from that perspective. And my co-founders of NAMA include Jonathan Landick and Dawn Osborne, who are both on the call as well. And they come from a very rich background of food systems, advocacy, and scientific research, and spent a lot of time overseas where they were introduced to millets and why millets are so important. And I just wanted to give all of you a little bit of a background on how we came together and then how we teamed up with the fantastic team at University of Missouri, and Karuba and Dr. Meyer, Dr. Karuba and Dr. Meyer, and how they're helping us with bringing you this fantastic webinar presentation so that we can not only learn about why millets are important from a nutritional standpoint, but also, just why they're so significant from an agricultural perspective too. So a couple of things about this moving forward. We're going to be recording this session so you can share it with your friends and family who weren't able to attend. Please remember that closed captioning is available. That can help for us to have clarity, especially if it's difficult to hear. And moving forward, after our presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. It's down on the bottom set of the tools. There's also a chat, but we'd ask that you put the questions in the Q&A box, which is different. So thank you for that. Speaking of the chat box, I will be putting some links there as well. Of course, we'd like to invite you to join our listserv that is run by Dr. Osborne. That is an email listserv, so we'll put in that link there. I will also be sending a Slack invite link there. It's a generic Slack invite. Slack is an app that allows for group collaboration. So I'll be putting that in there as well. And we'd love to have you over on Slack where we can do some brainstorming and development behind our organization. We are a brand new organization and we're volunteer run. So if you'd like to help and excited about our work, we would love to have you join us. We'll also be having a monthly meeting, and that will be next Friday. So if you'd like information, I will put a Zoom link in the chat as well, so you can join us for our actual, it's more of the working group side of things, not the webinar. We'll be talking about our curriculum moving forward throughout the year, and we'll also be creating some steering committees and some working groups around things like agronomy and farming, or around marketing of millets and how we get some dialogue with retailers and chefs, those kind of more specific things. So if you have an opinion and you've got skill and wisdom, we'd love to have you join us. So again, thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. And I will be passing the microphone over to our presenters. So please ask me a question in the chat if you have any questions.
So thanks, Joni. I am Rob Myers with the University of Missouri, and I'm going to be your first presenter today. We're going to do a tag team with myself and a good colleague of mine, David Brenner, who I worked with for many years. And this will be kind of our kickoff webinar for the series of a year-long recognition of the Year of the Millet 2023, so named by the United Nations Food and Ag Organization. There's a lot of interest in millets around the world, and I hope to give you an introduction to them along with David Brenner today, and then you're going to hear more details about millets and the other webinars here. We're into the food aspects, nutrition, uses of millets, some of their ancient history, and other topics. So today is just a kickoff and intro of. So Bethany, maybe you can stop the poll now. And what we'll do is I'm going to give a talk to kick things off and then turn it over to David Brenner, and then we'll have some time for questions. But at any time, you can pop a question into the question and answer box on the screen, and we'll get to those before we wrap up today. So one of the big questions with millets is, what are millets? We hear that question a lot in terms of how you would classify them. One way we can look at it is these are grass crops that are grown annually. They have typically small rounded seed. They're domesticated for human production, human use. Sometimes they're called ancient grains, and their biggest use has been in Africa and Asia, but certainly some use in North America. Another way they get classified when we go to the grocery stores, you'll often see them listed as gluten-free because all of the millets fit into that category. And the millets in general, they have this categorization as ancient grains, but so do other things we see like amaranth, quinoa, sometimes buckwheat is thrown into that. It's just kind of really a marketing term. There's no official designation for what is an ancient grain, but certainly all these millets were domesticated a long time ago, some earlier than others, as I'll mention as we're going through these. I'm just trying to get the poll off of my screen so I can see the slides a little more easily. Bethany, I don't know if that's something you can get off of the screen. So anyway, one thing I wanted to share is just that when we talk about the millets as having rounded seeds, that they are all pretty common in terms of the roundness of the seeds. They're not perfectly round, not like a ball bearing or anything, but you can see from this photo I just took of some millets that I had on hand at home that they're pretty similar in shape. So they're not an elongated seed like a wheat seed or an oat seed, but they certainly do vary a lot in size and color. Now, Adlai millet on the lower right is more of an unusual one in that it's got this hard fruiting body called a caryopsis that the seeds are inside of, but generally a fairly small seed, as you can see here. Pearl millet, which I didn't have a seed of, would be probably of the ones shown here closest to sorghum in the size of the seed. So one thing we can say about the millets is that there are a lot of them. A lot of things are called millets. Again, they fit under this category of annual grasses, and the annual grasses have a number of things that fit into that category. Corn and rice and wheat would be the big three in this area. And then there are other ones that we would also call cereal grains like wheat, so oats, barley, rye, triticale. One thing the cereal grains have in common, besides a different seed shape than the millets, is that they are cool season plants. They're going to do better in cool weather. In the United States, many of them are planted in the fall and they'll overwinter and then harvest in early to midsummer. Whereas corn and rice are more warm season plants. They're going to be intolerant to frost. They do their best growing in the heat of the summer, and millets are also in that category. All the millets would be considered warm season. Adlai millet is a slight exception, and in some environments it can be a perennial, but otherwise these are all annual plants where we plant them in the spring, late spring, early summer, and then harvest them that fall. So why grow millets? Well, there's a lot of different reasons we might do that. In general, these are pretty tough plants. They're widely adapted around the world. Some of them grow at higher elevations, but many of them are grown in both tropical and temperate zones, so they have pretty wide distribution. They are adapted to tough conditions in terms of many of them are fairly drought tolerant, but some, as I'll mention later, can be grown in wetter conditions as well. They're certainly what we'd call underutilized grains, especially when we look at North America in terms of having a lot more potential to be used than they currently are. And the bottom line is these are plants that can add biodiversity to cropping systems for both economic and ecological benefits, including soil health. The millets come from different areas of the world. So one thing I'm trying to convince you of here at the very beginning is these are all very different plants. I showed you that table with like rice and corn. Really, when I think of millets, I'm looking at them as being as different as rice is from corn. Yes, they have some commonality in that their seeds are small and rounded shape, but They really have very different backgrounds. They're all used for human food, but these are not only different species of plants, they're also from different genera. So very different botanical plants. So we have some that were domesticated in Africa. Many others came from different parts of Asia. As far as their adaptation in the US, it does vary. We see a lot of differences here. Some are better for dry conditions. Proso, pearl millet, foxtail millet are all ones that do very well in dry conditions. The other three I list here can do pretty well when it's dry, but Japanese and browntop are a little more adapted to wet conditions, particularly Japanese millet. And then they do vary in their size and vigor. So we just have to keep in mind these are very different plants. It's a little bit dangerous to lump them all together because they are so different from each other. And here's just a few of them. What I'd like to do next is to kind of walk you through some of the individual species of millets, just to give you a little better feel for their characteristics. So in North America, and particularly the United States, pearl millet would be the most commonly used of the millets outside of sorghum. It's also called bulrush or cattail millet. You can see how these seed heads or grain heads look sort of like cattails. It's originally domesticated for use in Africa, where it's still extensively used. Now, in the US, it's been mainly used as a forage, even though it was domesticated as a human food, the seed. But instead, we're harvesting in the US the whole plant to feed for animal use. It does have the highest seed yield potential, however, of the millets other than sorghum. So there are grain types that are shorter. They'll be about 4 to 4 feet tall or so. And then there are forage types that are quite a bit taller. They'll be maybe 7 feet tall on average, can be a little taller than that. So they have more biomass for harvesting the leaves, stems, and grain for livestock use. But just keep in mind, grain is certainly perfectly edible for people to use. In the US, when these grain types have been harvested, the primary market has been for poultry, although it can be fed to any number of livestock. And I've often joked that pearl millet is sort of like bird feeders on a stick, because if you have a field of it growing, I've been troubled with research plots. The birds love to come and eat it. So we have small plantings of it. Sometimes we've had to put netting up to keep the birds off of it. In fact, I've even encouraged small acreage farmers to grow this, tie a few seed heads together and sell it as kind of an easy to make bird feeder, because the birds will land on it and enjoy pecking away at the seed. One thing that's a little different about pearl millet compared to most of the other millets is it's planted in wider rows. These are planted here on 30-inch rows, which is typically how I did it in research plots. The other millets are usually planted in narrow rows, more like wheat or barley or something, oats, where they're planted maybe 6 or 7 inches apart in rows. That's reflecting the fact that pearl millet's a little more vigorous crop with more leafy area. And in Africa, sometimes they'll plant other things with it. They might plant cowpeas in between the rows, for example. And there's even ornamental types of pearl millet. You can see these purple ones here. You may have noticed these ornamental plantings, a very striking looking plant. Now, proso millet, I said pearl millet is the most widely used in the US in terms of acreage because of its forage use, but proso millet is pretty close to it. They would be about 500,000 acres of proso millet in the US, and it is by far the biggest for seed harvest. It's also called broomcorn millet, hog millet, and common millet. In fact, there's a few things called broomcorn millet, which I'll share as we go along. It is widely used around the world for its seed. You can see it's got an attractive golden color. In the US, it's grown primarily in what we call the High Plains region of western Nebraska, eastern Colorado. It's best adapted to some of these drier, cooler growing areas, and that reflects that it was domesticated in northern China. In fact, it's probably the oldest of the millets, having been domesticated around 10,000 years ago. So it truly is an ancient grain. One thing you can say about proso millet is if you go to any grocery store in America or Canada, this is the one you're going to run into. Probably 99.99% of the millet sold in grocery stores is proso millet. And usually it's just generically labeled millet, like these 2 bags on the left. I put on that picture on the right of kodo millet just to show that if there might occasionally be in an ethnic food aisle or ethnic market, another type of millet, but in regular grocery stores, it's pretty much always going to be a proso millet. Foxtail millet is an interesting one that I have enjoyed growing in Missouri. It does quite well in many areas as well. It has a lot of different names. And this is a good reminder, looking at all the names of foxtail millet. If you ever order millet seed, be sure to specify what you want, because I've had farmers tell me, yeah, I went in to order some pearl millet and I ended up with this stuff that doesn't look anything like pearl millet, because it gets a little confusing in the seed industry, just so many things lumped under millets. These other names for foxtail millet reflect some areas where the seed was found being used, but it did originate in the China area. Again, more northern China, we believe. And what's interesting to me is in the US, we have another crop from China that has become one of our two major crops, namely soybeans. In fact, the farm that I grew up on in central Illinois, the man who farmed it before my dad, he told me in the 1960s when I was a boy, he said, well, I was the first farmer to grow soybeans in this area. And he would have grown it in the 1920s. And that area of Illinois is very close to Decatur, which is now called the soybean capital of the world. So I tell you that story just to illustrate that it's interesting. We adopted soybeans so heavily from China, and yet we haven't adopted foxtail millet very much. It is used some for a hay crop and a little bit as a cover crop in the United States, but not grown too widely. And it's hard to say why, because it's certainly well adapted here. Might have to do with just the uses of the crop, but soybeans itself started out for decades as a hay crop before being used for seed harvest. So I think it's got potential that's certainly untapped. So a fun fact about the foxtail millet is that the whole seed head, what's called the spray, is sometimes harvested to sell for pet birds. If you go into a pet food store, you may have seen bags of this sold in the pet bird aisle, and it's very popular for people with parakeets, canaries, and so on. Japanese millet's another interesting one. We have a farmer not too far from where I live in central Missouri that has regularly grown Japanese millet for the wildlife market. And among the millets, this one is the most tolerant of wet soils. It's often planted for ducks, turkeys, and doves. It can grow on upland sites. It doesn't need to be in a wet situation. And in fact, I've grown it on lighter textured soils, sandier soils, but it's the only millet that will tolerate in flooded conditions. So it can live for a while in completely flooded fields as long as part of the plant is above water. It can't be completely submerged or lie in that situation. And you can just see a photo here of a food product made from it, in this case called barnyard millet, but it is Japanese millet. Lots of diversity in all of these millets. I just came across this photo from a research paper I thought was kind of interesting, showcasing some of the different seed heads of millets, some of the appearance as it was maturing, and some of the seed colors. Now, seed color is really important when you look at any grain, because as humans, we've pretty much always selected ones that were lighter in color. A lot of the seeds that we use today as food crops, as wild plants, were black or gray or brown. And in the human selection process over thousands of years, we've tended to select for the lighter colored ones. So if you were a plant breeder working on millets, that could be a goal you would have to select for a lighter colored seed. Browntop millet is yet another one of the millets that you do see some in North America. It's probably the least common of the ones I'm mentioning, along with finger millet, but it is grown some. It's also somewhat tolerant of damp soils, used a little bit as a forage in the southeastern US, sometimes as a cover crop. This one was domesticated in southern India. I had a little hard time finding a fun fact on this one, but it does have higher iron content than just about all the millets I could find data on. So I thought that was interesting. Certainly for people wanting to get more iron in their diet would be one to take a look at. Finger millet is one I've always enjoyed growing. It's also called ragi, and it has a history of use both in Africa and Asia. It's very popular in India. It's still today, and is an important food for a lot of the different regions in India. Like most of these millets, it has some good nutritional qualities, including good iron, calcium, fiber, low glycemic index. The fun fact about it to me is that these seed heads, they'll start out like your fingers are held up straight, and then over time, as it's maturing, it'll start to curl shut like you're closing your fist. And it's kind of fun to watch that as the season progresses in the field. Now, sorghum is an interesting case. I personally don't really think of sorghum as a millet, but you do find it referenced in the literature sometimes as the great millet. And it does have some characteristics like the other millets. It's got a smaller rounded seed. It's in this case domesticated in Africa, where some of the other millets come from. In the United States, a lot of farmers call it milo instead of sorghum, but it is a major crop. It's grown on about 70 million acres. Now, to put that in context, that sounds like a lot of acres, and it is. That's more area than all the wheat grown in the United States, but worldwide, I think there's something like 700 million acres of wheat. So it's a big crop, but not as big as something like wheat, rice, or corn worldwide. In the United States, it's grown mainly to the south and west of corn because it's better adapted to dry conditions. The fun fact about it is just how many types of sorghum there are. Besides the type I've shown here, which is a semi-dwarf grain type grown on about 5 million or more acres in the US, there's taller forage types that may be 7 feet or so tall, 7, 8 feet. And then there's even taller biomass types that can get up to 15 feet tall. And I've been in the field with variety trials of those, and they're truly amazing plants. They just tower over you. There's also sweet sorghum types that have a high sugar content used to make sorghum syrup. Some of you may have had that. And there's even a type of sorghum that's a little different species called sorghum vulgare that's used to make brooms from. So if you buy like a traditional wooden broom that's made with sorghum, believe it or not. And here's just a photo of a couple of the types of sorghum. The forage types are on the right, and in the middle, those really tall ones with the seed heads, those are the biomass types. And in that picture, those are probably about 11 to 12 feet tall. That's a little demonstration I grew several years ago. Okay, and then just quickly, I'm going to mention some other millets that are sometimes grouped into this category. Adlai millet or Job's tears is on the upper right there. That's the one with the rounded hard fruiting structure. We call it caryopsis. Those are often used for jewelry. Is kind of a fun fact about that. Kodo or Koda millet is another one that sometimes shows up. I had shown you a picture of some food from that. Interestingly, it's considered a noxious weed in the US, but it's certainly a food crop in other countries. Teff is a really interesting one. The picture in the lower right corner is teff. It's used some for hay in the United States, including horse hay. But in Ethiopia, where probably 90% of the seed harvested teff is grown, it's used for injera bread. And it's a really delightful bread product you may have had in an Ethiopian restaurant. And then the last one is fonio. And I think David Brenner will mention a few other things that could be considered millets as well. But these would be some of the more minor millets, so to speak. So just to kind of wrap things up, even though these millets all have great potential, there definitely are some barriers to further use of them, especially in North America. So what I have found working with alternative crops is buyers that are thinking about using them in food products or other uses, they just want to see that they're easily available. They tend to ask questions like, okay, that's great, they've got these wonderful nutritional characteristics, but is there a warehouse of it I can order some seed from? They don't necessarily want to go out and contract with farmers, although that's changing. There's a little more willingness to do that direct involvement with the producers. Farmers themselves may not be very familiar with millets, although I have found farmers are quick to try a new crop if they see that the market is available and it has some profit potential. Now, we do need, with most of these millets, we need adapted varieties. There's been some breeding with proso millet and to a lesser extent with pearl millet in the United States, but pretty much the others, all we have to work with is seed that's been brought in from other countries. We need more infrastructure. There's not much in the way of weed control or pest control products for most of these. There's no crop insurance available for most of them. And that's important because if a farmer wants to grow a crop, they need to get an operating loan quite often, and the bank won't give them a loan unless they have crop insurance. And these are competing against subsidized crops like corn and soybeans and wheat. They have government support behind them, a lot of research behind them. So it's not an impossible picture. I want to leave you with an optimistic view that there's great hope for these, but we just need to invest in them and work collaboratively together to move them forward. So just to summarize, and then I'll turn it over to David. Certainly these millets have great potential to add diversity in farming systems. They can provide a lot of resiliency for climate change. Many of them are really good in hot, dry conditions. The diverse genetics that are available provides a lot of potential for various uses and further plant breeding, but they certainly deserve more research, exploration, and development. So I hope some of you will help with that as we go forward in whatever way fits your interest and background. So thanks. I'll be happy to answer questions in a little bit, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to David Brenner to load his slides. And David is a curator with the National Plant Germplasm System. So David, if you can unmute and turn on your video for a second. And his is what would be called a curator for millet and some other crops as he's listing here. So David, I will turn it over to you.
There we go. Thanks, Rob. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a curator in the National Plant Germplasm System. So our mission is to conserve seeds, mostly of all kinds of crop plants, and we conserve them over the long term. So they're available for research and other kinds of cultural uses. And I work closely with Sam Flomo, my technician, and I'm responsible for a grab bag of many different crops, including spinach, parsley, dill, fennel, amaranth, on and on, but also millets. And of course, the topic today is the millets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about prehistory and tradition and the National Plant Germplasm Systems collection, and then my own activities here in Ames, Iowa, and a little bit about crop wild relatives, which are a special fascination of mine. So foxtail and proso millet originated in China about 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. It's just as Rob said. And there's good archaeological evidence from digs finding remnants of these plants. And then there's genetic evidence for this long history from the way the diversity is partitioned within the crops and compared to wild plants that are still in that area. And then there's also linguistic evidence for this. There are some very old words related to millets that are supposed to have originated with this long ago domestication of millets and then spread with millets into Japan and south into Tibet and west also. So a kind of cultural hearth close to the origin of agriculture, of culture and language that spread with millets. And these are partial citations for articles about that, and rather recent one. It's new scholarship on these topics. And this is a picture of processing millet in the mountains in Taiwan. And the millets that I'm talking about are encased in bony bracts, a little shell. And you can see this if you go to the grocery store birdseed section, and proso millet in its husk is the common little football shape, usually tan, but usually a few bright red ones mixed in also, seeds. So they've grown the millet, put them in this hollowed out tree trunk, and they're banging it hard to break that husk. And and most of the millets need this kind of processing. So there's the bracts and then a corn kernel like rounded seed inside, kind of like a ball bearing. And then the next step in processing it is, and here she's emptying the pounded, broken up millets into this wide, flat basket. And then on the right, tossing the basket around to separate the bits of broken husk from those kernels. And this is a very old traditional way of cleaning seeds. All of our ancestors did this. I believe it was probably developed in Africa before the humanity spread out of Africa, because it's everywhere that humans are, including throughout the Americas. And there are illustrations of people doing this in medieval Europe, And I've seen practitioners do this. It's a beautiful ballet-like thing of swirling and swishing, and the seeds sort themselves into different textures with the trash in one place. And then there are ways to toss it in the air so that the wind carries the chaff away. You can Google some of these examples as videos on YouTube. And here's a picture of an example from Minnesota, where the same technology is being used to clean wild rice. It was everywhere, and it still works, and still an active way for people to clean seeds and make their living to this day. And now a little bit about the plant germplasm systems millet collection. So the millets are within the National Plant Germ System partitioned to different stations. We're all doing the same gene bank work in one system, and we've got one online database where you could, as a researcher, request seeds from any of these different millets and not even know which station it comes from. But we have a sister station in Griffin, Georgia, where most of the millets are, including sorghum and pearl millet and digitaria. And they have the wild panicums, which include switchgrass, and switchgrass is a big collection. And then the millets I work with are the Iowa millets. I'm in Ames, Iowa, with Iowa State University, and I have the panicum and foxtail and kind of cloa. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Sowie millet, which is a odd but kind of special example that makes a fun story. And then the teff is at our sister station in Pullman, Washington. This system of dividing the wild panicums from the millet panicums is a little bit odd in our germplasm system, but those two parts of the same genus are separated in those different places. And the wild panicum seeds are so much like a millet, with the same structure, with a hard bony shell and then a seed inside. And many of them were eaten by traditional Aboriginal people anywhere they were growing. So they're not that far from millets. And I hope it seems possible to me that especially the ones that are grown widely, like the switchgrass, could possibly be a food as a millet. And that's something I haven't tried myself, but it's kind of fun to think that you can just buy switchgrass seeds that are just about like a millet, but growing on perennial plants. Anyway, our work is partitioned into accessions. So an accession is grown separately from all the other accessions, and it has a unique accession number. Ours usually have a prefix PI. So an accession originated in just one place, where maybe a collector was in Tibet or India or South America, or maybe a wild plant population in Florida. And that collector collects seeds of a group of plants and then keeps it separate from all the other collections, and probably gives it a collector's number. And then when we accession it into the germplasm system, we give it an accession number and keep it separate from all the other accessions. So we don't mix seeds, and we try not to mix pollen. In this case, there are different plastic tents, which is how I grow the millets. And there'll be a plastic tent separating one millet from the next millet. And I could usually plant and then harvest seeds about 3 months later in a greenhouse setting. My predecessors used to do this in the field, which was higher risk and more difficult than what we're doing now in a greenhouse. But these tents are to keep different accessions separate from each other, so they don't share pollen or seeds or anything, and they're kept as we received them originally. And so it's long-term conservation. And these are also pictures of accessions. Our gene bank has this walk-in cooler. It's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is most of the millet collection in quart jars. So when we receive an accession, the seeds are usually just one packet, and we write an accession number on it and then keep it separate from all the other accessions, and grow those original seeds to get an increased seed lot. And then that seed lot goes into these jars, where at the request of a researcher, we can go and get a small sample and send it out to them. And so there are something like 2,500 of these jars of just millets. And behind the camera, there's a huge section of corn, which is a much bigger deal than millets, but we have a substantial millet collection right here in all these separate quart jars with one accession each. And then eventually, as those seeds age, we'll probably take some of those seeds and plant them to get another seed lot still of the same accession. So if there's a change of original seed and then increased seeds and then another increased seed, but all from the same accession and all kept separate from the other accessions. And my 3 millets, the echinocloas, the panicums and ceterias, about 1,000 each of the panicums and ceterias, and then a smaller echinocloa collection. By percent available, I mean that we have sufficient seed quantities and known viability, germination, so that we trust the seeds to be able to send them out to researchers. And the percent availability always lags a bit behind the number of accessions for a bunch of administrative reasons, usually bad seeds of some kind. But they're all pretty high availability, around 90%. And then the adaptation observation column is when I've grown them out in the field and taken notes about their maturity time and how tall they are, and generally taken a picture. And I'm gradually working through the collection, growing out accessions to better document what they are, since many of them have been in the seed jars since the 60s, and we don't really know very much about their performance. And for the ceteria, I've been able to send a sample of seeds to a collaborator in the Czech Republic who grew them and then sent back notes that we were able to load in GRIN, which is our database. And occasionally we get data back from researchers that we send seeds to that we can put right in our database and make available to others. The echinocloa, 18 minor species, and I've 18 species, but mostly Frumentaceae, the barnyard millet. And I've been able to collect some of the wild species, especially in Florida. And these, the wild echinocloas here in Ames, Iowa, are very tolerant of standing water, just as Rob says. There are low, poorly drained places, especially around rivers, where it's the only weed, and it can even be mowed to make it kind of a turf because it tolerates standing water even for weeks at a time. And then here's an accession number, PI 182304. And when we talk about our germplasm, a lot of it is in the terms of these different accessions, which are known to have certain traits. In this case, it's the largest seeded accession in echinocloa, which is easy to tell because on our database, that data has been loaded into a way that's easy to sort. And we often don't know what's special about an accessions. We just keep tremendous numbers of them and maintain them. And then future scientists can eventually test them when challenged with a new disease or any other problem. And there's enough diversity there that something's variable and something will be found to solve problems that we don't even know about yet. And here's a little bit about the panicum, proso millet. P. Millesium is the proso millet, which is by far the most important in my collection. It's a viable, successful crop in the high plains. And Sumatrense is also called little millet. It's grown in parts of India, and we have a substantial collection to it. And then the Herticale, just 3 accessions, and only one of them is of the domesticated type, which is called Sami, and it was grown in the Colorado River Basin by pre-Columbian people, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. This certain PI number is a parent of Plateau, which is one of the main new cultivars in the high plains, and it contributed a special starch type. So the special starch type has exact culinary principles that are required by Asian consumers. You can use that starch to make a stretchy taffy-like candy that's real important in Japan. And it's a different thing, which I hope chefs will get a chance to experiment with, because it just has different properties. And the seeds are unusually long-lived. We've got good seeds from 1951. That's 72 years with good germination. And some that old are aging. So our tests of the viability have shown they had to be replaced with fresh seeds. And I'm growing them now in the greenhouse to get replacement stocks. Okay, and here's a picture of proso millet. So I've seen fields in Nebraska where they're growing maybe a little more than 2 feet tall. And people that have worked with both say it looks a lot like rice with a panicle that has all these grains close together. And here's a picture of horticale, which grows well here in Iowa, which is a long way from where it's from near Mexico in the southwestern United States, Colorado River Basin, but beautifully studied. Gary Navin has written this up and collected most of the examples that are available to anyone. It's such a fun, different story that maybe consumers would like to buy something that has this history that's so different from the other millets. And it's easy to grow. And Native Seed Search is one of the seed companies that has it available for sale. So if you want samples to grow in your backyard, just to experiment with, as with all the other millets, they're good commercial supplies. The foxtails are my favorite. I think they're just so beautiful to look at. 38 different taxa. They're used a lot in research because they're easy to work with, a small number of chromosomes, and well suited to some kinds of research. And the largest seed here with a certain PI number, it's from China. And apparently people have been working with these foxtail millets there for a long time. And there's a picture of foxtail millets, beautiful ropey heads. I think this particular variety is intended for use as sprays to feed caged birds. It's called Butte. And here's one of my observation fields, 2018. I had 200 different rows of millets. So I took the seeds out of the seed jars and planted a separate row of each of those 200 accessions in order to take notes on things like how tall they grow and can they mature seeds before our frosts, and get images. And I'd like to do more of this to better document what we already have. And here's one of the things I saw. So this is a foxtail millet that has good dry down on most of the heads, and then some of the heads are later and green. And my theory is that these later green heads are from crossing with wild foxtail millets, which are just about the most common weed in our area, 2 or 3 different species, very, very common. And I think they cross-pollinated to make that hybrid type that's green and has longer bristles in the middle. But I don't know. I hope to be able to find a collaborator that can study this with me and find out if I'm right or wrong. And now a little bit about the crop wild relatives. This is Soteria magna with Gary Peterson, who was on a plant collecting trip with me near Tampa, Florida. So these plants grow taller than a person, and they have prop roots, a lot like corn. It's a corn-sized plant, magnificent, huge plants, and such a surprise that Soteria can even do this. And here's a Soteria corrugana, which is a lot like the crop plant, but people haven't really done the research about which wild Soterias are related to each other. It's a little bit understudied as compared to the major crops. So there's new areas of research, and we can send seeds right away because we've collected them now. And there, it's a kind of Walterii, which has this unusual, very fuzzy stem. It's a little bit bristly, so it's not really comfortable to hold, but it's got all these fuzzy hairs on the stem, and it grows in this slough near Tampa, Florida. The wettest place around is just about right for kind of claws. And so I've been collecting these crop wild relatives. They're where the genes are. When people domesticated plants, they just took a small number of plants with certain desirable traits and selected from those and selected from those. And they left a lot of the genetics behind in those crop wild relatives. And now that plant breeding is getting more sophisticated, those crop wild relatives still have the genetic diversity that's useful to solve modern problems. And throughout the gene banks worldwide, people are looking more to these crop wild relatives now. And I've been able to collect some of them for these crops. And there's a citation below for a book chapter that I co-authored about crop wild relatives. And here, as a curator, my first priority is to regenerate fresh seeds as the collection ages, and we have a lot of old seed lots. And I'm adding these tempered observations when I can grow plants in field settings. And I'm seeking the crop wild relatives, especially from the United States. And that's because the United States is less restricted than a lot of other countries about what seeds I can get. And that's about what I have. If you use this search term, search GRIN, our database comes up and you can explore what we have and see more about the National Plant Germplasm System. We're not a main source of seeds. If you can get by with commercial seeds, it's much better that you do use those commercial seeds for gardening, but for the kind of research that needs a lot of diversity, we have it. And that's about what I have. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop my sharing.
Thanks, David. That was a great overview of the plant germplasm system and the amazing wealth of diversity of millets within it. It's for those of you that have never had a chance to visit one of the plant germplasm locations. I've been to David's location several times, and it's just, you hear about the famous seed storage in the Svalbard. How do you say that, David?
Yeah, Svalbard.
In Norway.
It's an island off of Norway where there's an underground vault in the permafrost to keep seeds alive, even if most of civilization disappears. There'll still be seeds there. They're still good for a while. It's one of our backup places. We also back up at Fort Collins, Colorado.
Yep, and so there are equivalent places in places like Ames, Iowa, and Georgia, and Oregon, as David was saying. So those are very important in the efforts to breed new varieties and do the type of research that is helpful for these crops. So we have a few questions in the Q&A, David, that you and I can go through. The first one was about whether the slides will be available. I'm certainly happy to make my slides available. We'll also have the recording of the webinar that will be sent out to folks. David, is it okay if your slides are shared?
Yes, absolutely. Please.
Okay. It looks like the next question is, since there's been relatively little work done by breeders on millets other than pearl and proso, can you give farmers some guidance on how to navigate seed selection, such as from USDA or other resources? So for most of the millets that we talked about today, there's just not a lot of choice with varieties. Now, foxtail millet, there are several varieties in the trade. Pretty much all or most of them were imported from other places like China or Europe. They weren't necessarily developed here, but there's probably at least a half a dozen varieties of foxtail millet available. Certainly quite a few proso millets, the pearl. Now, the other ones like browntop, finger millet, you have to do a little hunting to find any seed, but then there'll probably just be something that's generically labeled browntop. There may be types from different seed companies that are a little different from each other, but what happens with these less common seeds is they just get labeled as browntop millet and you don't have any idea what it is really. So that's what we call variety not stated. So that's a reason we need more plant breeding and variety development. Anything you want to add on the variety question, David?
No, I think that's pretty good. There are foxtail millet varieties, cultivar name varieties that you can get, and maybe one variety of Echinocloa, and then a real active breeding program with new varieties coming out for the proso millet.
The next question is about, are there any estimates for the current size of domestic market for food millets? So keep in mind, like I said earlier, that 99% plus of the millet you're going to see in Canada and America, US is proso millet. So one way we can guess at the size of the market is there's about 500,000 acres of proso millet seed produced. Now, some of that does go into the export market. I personally don't know what percent is exported. We might have somebody on the call that knows that. And if so, maybe you can type in the chat. But I would, just say that's roughly the size of the market, 500,000 acres worth of seed. If you wanted that in terms of tonnage, proso millet in the dry regions that it grown is not super high yielding. So if we conservatively said there was 2,000 pounds an acre or 1 ton an acre, that'd mean about 500,000 tons of production in the US and maybe roughly that much demand. I don't know, David, would you have a different spin on it? You might have heard some things I haven't about the market.
There's a substantial export market to Asia, especially that plateau variety that has a particular starch type. And then other kinds are going, I think, to Africa, where there's a lively custom of eating millets. And that's about as good as I can say. I don't work directly with those things.
The other thing I would say
And
about
birdseed, of
proso,
course, is a major market.
I was just going to say the birdseed market is going to use up quite a bit of that proso millet. I don't have the exact percentage, unfortunately. Okay, Don Osborne says he's happy to comment on that. Don, do you want to unmute and comment about the market situation? Oh, no, you're talking about the comment on the name millet. We'll go ahead and let you answer that one on the name millet, where that's concerned.
Thanks. Just on the markets for a second, I did note that at one time not long ago, Mexico was both one of the top producers of sorghum and the top importers of sorghum, and most of that sorghum comes from the U.S. But that's just a by the way in that market question. But about the name millet, it's kind of a linguistic trick. In European languages, the languages of the colonial powers, really you had millet, meal, meal. You have that name applied to very small grains, and then it's a little more complicated than that. But basically, when encountering different kinds of millets, they get annexed given names, if you will, pearl millet or finger millet or what have you, and it all kind of lumps under one category. So it's a little bit of a linguistic accident. On the other end of the spectrum, India, which is really the crossroads of millets in the world, or I could say South Asia, there is no one word for millet, and they actually, as I understand it, had to invent a term for in Hindi for the International Year of Millets. And then maybe Karuba can verify on that, but because they have completely different names for each of the millets because they're different grains. It's that perspective. So that answers the question.
I often wish we did have completely different names in the English language for the millets, because it's kind of unfortunate in a way they're all thrown together. It's like, again, taking corn and wheat and rice and saying, well, those are all the same plant, which they're not at all. They're very different uses and so on. David, the next question was for you. How do you handle the pollination in those millet tents that you do?
The millets I have self-pollinate at very high frequencies. So even in the field, there's not very much outcrossing. And those plastic tents are intended to control pollen movement. And they work with amaranths, which outcross more. So mostly I have a plastic tent that's not entirely airtight, but in order for pollen to get in and out, it has to loft up to a vent at the top and then waft over to another accession and have the pollen land there. And at very, very small outcrossing rates, I don't worry about it.
But do you do anything like, do you shake the plants against each other, or you just let the air movement within the tent make the pollination happen?
Air movement, but it doesn't even need that. The male and female parts are so close together in millet flowers that they're going to self-pollinate.
Very good. Okay, the next question is, been there any research published on finger millets for grains in the US? Well, there's certainly a lot of papers on finger millets, research papers, particularly from India, some from other countries in Asia, a little bit from African research. There's been almost no research on finger millet in the US. You'll see some extension people like me talk about it a little bit, but David, you might have tracked it a little more. What do you think? Have you seen any research papers on finger millet in the US?
Well, about 10 years ago, the Gates Foundation decided to make a big bet on finger millets. It has certain advantages that they thought were important at the time. So a lot of money was poured into it. And I don't know what's come of that, or whether the Gates Foundation still has that priority. I don't work with finger millet directly, but I know the curator at Griffin, Georgia, and she's very enthusiastic about it. And that's about all I know.
I think that Gates investment was mostly overseas. So yeah.
If I may, sorry, if I could interject something. I am not an expert on that, and I'm not an expert like either Rob or David, but I did read that there was an experiment in New Mexico with developing finger millet for cattle feed. Now, that's not for grain. There is somebody at Michigan State who's been doing some research in finger millet and teff. But these are few and far between. And the grains, I think there was a question someplace else about where we source them. It's really by imports. So if I want to get finger millet or pearl millet, for that matter, grains, I end up getting it from Indian companies through a store or online.
Yeah, thanks,
Don.
Don.
Nice to see them growing here.
Okay. The next one is in terms of the U.S. market status for millets, how easy would it be for a farmer to sell millets? So I've worked on that quite a bit in the past. Again, the two more common ones, proso millet and pearl millet, they definitely have markets. The ease of accessing those depends a little on where you're at. If you're in the High Plains area, very easy to market proso millet. If you were in, let's say, Virginia, trying to grow proso millet, you'd have to ship it a long ways, or you would market it to the birdseed market locally, which is what I would advocate for somebody that's outside of the High Plains area. Now, proso is not necessarily going to grow great in other parts of the U.S. Again, it's better suited to that drier, cooler part of the High Plains. Something like pearl millet can also be sold for birdseed, but not necessarily easily. It may be easier to direct market it to consumers or do something more like novelty of cutting some heads, selling them in bundles for people to hang up on a fence. So you can get creative with some of those, but market access is a big challenge for anything other than proso millet in terms of the food market. Maybe some ethnic markets might be possibilities, or through an active farmers market, depending on the clientele at that market. But that is a challenge for sure. Next question I'm going to throw to you, David. Other than pearl millet, are there any millets which could be hybridized? What do you think on that one?
Well, the sorghum, if you consider it a millet, is almost all hybrid. There's a system using male sterility to make hybrid seeds. So that's almost all the sorghum. And I don't know that people have working male sterile systems to make hybrid seeds or anything equivalent to, say, detasseling that they do in corn. I think there are male sterile lines that exist in China, at least on a research basis. So if it happens at all, it's not quite ready to go, and the pollen just doesn't, there's not much pollen, it doesn't travel very much. It stays pretty much in that flower. So it would be a hard topic.
We've got a few more questions. We'll try to get through these quickly so we can wrap up here in 4 or 5 minutes. So are there any studies which relate millets to the reduction of depression? I understand they're good for diabetes and cancer. Are there any research into this publicly available? I haven't seen those studies, but I can't claim to know every single research article that's out there. David, have you come across anything like that?
No, I think mostly for people that have too much nutrition and too high of a glycemic index. It's the other side of that. It's going to digest slowly, so it's good for diabetics.
We can look into that a little more. We will have webinars later this year by people that really focus on the utilization of millet, and I think they'll be able to get into some of those questions a little further. What is the trend for consumer acceptance of millets as the food usage in the U.S.? So definitely there's strong interest in gluten-free and, to a lesser extent, ancient grains, and also trying new things more than there was, say, 20 years ago. So I think that bodes well for things like millets, but like anything, people need to be exposed to it. There needs to be consumer awareness increased, education being provided, and that's part of the reason we're doing these webinars, is to help get information out there.
My favorite answer is we need more celebrity chefs.
There you go. Hopefully we've got
other
one.
celebrities will help too. Yeah.
What would be the traits to be focused on for commercialization of millets? Well, people like David and I immediately think of seed yield, and then how easy is it to harvest the seed? Because it's one thing if there's a lot of seed there, but if it all falls off, which is what wild plants tend to do, before you're ready to go out and harvest it with a machine, then that's a problem. Or the plant falls down, which often happens with these less domesticated crops. Things like disease and insect resistance can be an issue depending on the species, but probably not as big as just the straight yield. And then the quality traits. As David said, if you can find unique quality, he mentioned the starch being important in proso millet. If the nutrition or the taste can be improved through breeding, those can be important assets too. We could talk for a long time on this, but that's a quick answer.
It's not really the agronomy that you can grow them. It just, can you get a market product that people will buy, and that's the problem.
Okay, I think the last one here, if millets are trialed in fields, how do researchers control the spread of those millets, such as through birds? It seems like some are considered noxious weeds. So the browntop millet is one there's a little bit of concern about in places. I had another reference to one called the ditch millet. That sometimes is a concern too, but yes, the birds can spread any of those because the birds will eat pretty much all of them. The good news is domesticated plants do not have a key weedy trait, which is that weedy plants, their seed, some of it is what we call hard seed. So it'll fall in the soil and some of it will generate the next year, some of it will generate in 2 or 3 years, some of it may not generate for 10 years. The domesticated annual plants, which largely would include the millets, don't have that. In other words, if the seed falls in the ground, it's all going to sprout sometime soon, either later that year or the next spring. And that makes it a lot easier to control it and get rid of it. But there can be other traits that contribute to weediness, such as being able to survive in the same growing conditions as other crops. And like whether it's rice or there can be millets that are weeds of proso millet, they can be weeds of each other. So again, that could be a long talk on the weediness, but David, any quick comments on that?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well.
Okay.
I don't see it spreading around my fields.
Yeah, so thanks for being with us. There's been some good comments in the chat and Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Landak, one of the founders of the North American Millet Alliance, to wrap us up for today. Jonathan.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, David, for being here today. Thanks to everyone for showing up and participating and for your wonderful questions. We'll try to send out additional information from today's webinar to those of you who participated and others. And a reminder that our next NAMA webinar will be on February 14th, and we'll let you know about that too in the subject to that. Thank you again, Rob Myers and David Brenner, and to everyone, and have a good evening.